Going originally on our publicity or our thing, we said that we were going to 22:28, and then the next one began at 22:39, and so I was wrong, and so instead of going to 22:28, we're going to 22:38, and that does make a little more sense. Let's go. Basically, this part of Luke is based on Mark 13. And Mark 13 is sometimes referred to as the little apocalypse. An apocalypse, that is the same word as, apocalypsis. Apocalypsis is the word for the revelation of John is the apocalypse, right? And I'm going to give you that 75-cent word again, eschatological. Remember the word eschatos in Greek. We have it in barbarian letters and in Greek letters. By the way, barbarian is anything other than Greek. Did you know that? Some people believe that the word barbaros comes from Greeks saying, well, if anyone cannot speak or write Greek, they are so stupid that all they can say is bar, 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 bar. And so that may be the reason why why everything other than Greek is referred to as barbaros. So I put it in both Greek letters, in barbarian letters, and in Greek letters. Eschatos means last. It's the opposite of protos, which means first. In Mark 13, we have what's called the eschatological discourse. And everyone understands it that way. And this is really a literary question. An apocalypse is a special kind of religious literature. The earliest apocalypse in the Bible, as far as we have, is the book of Daniel. And we're all familiar with the book of Revelation, which of course the Greek title is Apocalypsis Ioannou. The Apocalypsis Ioannou means the revelation of John. And sometimes it used to be called the Apocalypse. So we're familiar with the book of Daniel, which is sort of a timetable, and eventually you have one like a Son of Man that's coming. And then the book of Revelation has the second coming of Christ as well. Paul also has the second coming of Christ in his earliest letter, 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians 4:13 to 5:3 is all about the second coming of Christ. And that's in the very earliest letter of Paul, 1 Thessalonians. Well, a lot has been written about apocalypses. There was an important group in the Society of Biblical Literature, or SBL. By the way, I've been a member of SBL since 1977, and I've been to 25 or more annual meetings of SBL. This year we will be in San Antonio, God willing. There was a group that studied early Christian and Jewish apocalypses, and their findings were published in the 1970s under the title Apocalypse, Morphology of a Genre, edited by John Collins. And of course, what was important about that group is that the great scholar of early Christian apocalypses was Adela Yarbrough Collins, and the great scholar of Jewish apocalypses was John Collins, her husband. And then later, he taught at DePaul, and she taught at McCormick, and then later they both went to Notre Dame, and then they both went to the University of Chicago, and then they both went to Yale, and they're both now retired. And so he also wrote a book called The Apocalyptic Imagination, an introduction to the Jewish matrix of Christianity. And I was very privileged in graduate school. The Northwestern University actually bought a course, and they actually had John Collins come up on the train with a backpack, and he came up and taught his course on apocalyptic literature, and I was very privileged to take that course because I was writing a dissertation on 2 Thessalonians, which is an apocalypse in a way. Well, anyway, those were the days. Apocalypses include frequently apocalyptic timetables. And by timetables, we mean this thing is going to happen at this point, that thing is going to happen then, this other thing was going to happen then. So it's like a schedule for what's going to happen at the end of time. And we refer to them as apocalyptic timetables. And so these apocalyptic timetables detail for the readers of these writings what is going to happen and what must happen and what must not happen before and during the divine intervention that is coming. And apocalypses include, of course, the book of Daniel, the book of Revelation of John, or the Revelation to John, as it's sometimes called, and also the 13th chapter of Mark, which is referred to as the Little Apocalypse, or the Markan Apocalypse. Also, 2 Thessalonians 2, 3 through 12 is an apocalyptic timetable. So it's really, I hope that you think of it, you can think of it as a certain apocalyptic worldview, but you can certainly think of it as a type of literature that we find in the Gospel. I mean, we already know there's a whole bunch of different kinds of literature in the Bible, right? Right? Yes. You know, poetry in the Psalms, poetry in most of the prophets, Gospels, letters, something like a history in the book of Acts. So there's a lot of different genres of literature that existed in the ancient world. And so there was this thing called a biography, and most people think, most right-thinking people think that the Gospels are a certain kind of form of the Greek biography. So anyway, this is another genre of literature that you have in the Bible. Let's take a look at Luke 21 and read from chapter 21, verse 5, all the way through chapter 21, verse 11. Denny, would you do that?
When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, he said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon the other. It will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name and say, 'I am he.' And the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not fall immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven."
Thank you. All right, in verses 5 and 6, we have the prediction of the destruction of the temple. And this is taken directly from Mark 13, 1 and 2. It's got a direct parallel from Mark 13, 1 and 2 in Matthew 24. Basically, Matthew 24 is the parallel to Mark 13, and also Luke 21 is the parallel to Mark 13. Well, we know a lot about this. It's a well-known fact of church history that there was a revolt of the Jews in Palestine, Israel, whatever we're calling it. Usually I call it Syria, Palestine, Israel, whatever we're calling it. I want to make everybody mad, you see. But the Jews in Jerusalem and thereabouts had a revolt against the Roman occupation forces. And this war was known as the Jewish War, and it took place from 66 to 70 of the Common Era. The Romans, at the end of this war, laid siege to the city of Jerusalem, and they went in and destroyed the Second Temple in 70. This is the firmest date in the New Testament. If you doubt that date, then there are no firm dates at all in the New Testament, okay? And then there was a kind of a turncoat who was a Jewish fellow who became a Roman general and retired in Rome on a Roman general's pension, but he was Jewish, named Flavius Josephus, as I mentioned, he is the most important source for our understanding of Judaism in the Hellenistic period. And his two major works were the Jewish War and a much longer work, the Jewish Antiquities. And we have those, and they are excellent examples of Hellenistic Jewish writings. They, along with the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. If you want to know what Hellenistic Judaism was like, you read the Septuagint, and then you also read Josephus, and that's the main thing, really. Well, we know a lot about the Jewish war, and we know a lot about many other things about Judaism in antiquity, including the 4 sects of Judaism: Pharisaism, Essenism, Sadduceeism, and the Zealots. Those 4 sects of the Jews, Hiereses of the Jews, we know a lot about them from Josephus, and much of what Josephus says about the Essenes does indeed check out with much of what we can learn about the Essene group that was at the Dead Sea. All right, in 21:5 and 6 we have the prediction of the destruction of the temple. It's very important that this is historical or not. If it is historical, if Jesus did indeed predict the destruction of the temple, that means that Jesus knew in advance that the Jewish war was going to take place. Many scholars favor the idea that Jesus did not predict the destruction of the temple and did not predict the war between the Jews and the Romans in 66 through 70. So that's a point on which there's a lot of debate. If you think that this was sort of put into the mouth of Jesus to show that Jesus knew about the war that was coming, and therefore Jesus had the ability to predict the Jewish war and the destruction of the temple, and you think that that did not really go back to the historical Jesus, but you think that it was put into his mouth by the writer of Mark, then we refer to that kind of prophecy put in by the writer as ex eventu prophecy, or a vaticinium ex eventu. And so out of the event, you put that prophecy in the mouth of the person who is telling you all these things about the future. And so that makes the reader say, well, gee, he really knew about the future. So this is a matter of some debate. But nonetheless, the signs before the end are very important. But in 21:5 through 6, let me just read it for you according to the RSV text. And as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, he said, as for these things which you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. And so that is clearly a prediction of the destruction of the temple. There's no doubt that that prediction is there in the text. And the issue, of course, is where did it come from? And then there are more signs before the end. In apocalyptic literature, we frequently have what has been referred to as an apocalyptic timetable. In other words, here, the end is coming, and therefore here are the signs before the end, and when you see these signs happening, you know that the end is coming. And so it's kind of a thing that says, okay, X, Y, Z, etc., these things are going to happen before the end. We know this not only here in Luke 21 and of course in Mark 13, but we also know it from other places in the New Testament, particularly the book of Revelation. We know it in the Old Testament in the book of Daniel, and even in the New Testament in 2 Thessalonians 2, 3 through 12. It's an apocalyptic timetable of things that have to happen before the end comes. So Luke has it like this, and I'm reading Luke 21, 7 through 11, RSV. And they asked him, Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign when this is about to take place? And he said, Take heed that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and tumults, do not be terrified, for this must first take place, and the end will not be at once. Then he said to them, Nations will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes and in various places famines and pestilences, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. So in other words, there will be social disturbances of various kinds. In Mark and Matthew it says wars and rumors of wars, and Luke has it wars and tumults. Even natural disasters. There will be great earthquakes, famines and pestilences, terrors and great signs from heaven. So these are cosmic signs that will be unmistakable as cosmic signs, and they are there. So, and then in this literature, in this apocalyptic timetable, people will see what's going to happen, and then they will take heed and do what they're supposed to do before the end comes. Along with that, in chapter 21, verses 12 through 19, there will be persecutions foretold. And frequently in apocalyptic literature, there is this radical separation or radical division between the good guys and the bad guys. The elect, which is to say those who are already chosen to be among those who are going to be blessed, they are going to be persecuted before the coming of the Son of Man. The persecuted, the elect, are not to think out their speeches in case they are arrested. For, according to 21:15, I will give you a mouth and wisdom so that you will know what you're supposed to say. So the Holy Spirit will be given to the people, and they will say the right things, and they shouldn't think out their speeches in advance. And so the big deal is that what you're supposed to do is you are supposed to endure. Even Luke 21:16, you will be delivered up even by parents and brothers and kinsmen and friends, and some of you they will put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake. Then verse 18, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives. So that's the big deal in apocalyptic literature. You may be persecuted, maybe you probably will be persecuted, but even so, you're not supposed to crack under persecution. You're supposed to remain faithful to God under persecution. After that, there is the desolating sacrilege in verses 20 through 24. The desolating sacrilege has been is usually understood to be the sacrifice of pigs on the altar of the Jerusalem temple. Luke 21:20 edits that out in favor of, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. And so the desolating sacrilege, namely the sacrifice of pigs on the altar of God, the Hebrew God, which is in Mark and which Matthew preserves in Matthew 24, that has been edited out by Luke. And so instead of the desolating sacrilege on the altar, it is that Jerusalem is surrounded by armies, and therefore its desolation has come near. And so I would ask, you may disagree, but I would ask, does this perhaps confirm a later date for Luke, the Gospel of Luke? Since the details of the desolating sacrilege might not be interesting to Luke's primarily Gentile readers, especially if the temple has actually been destroyed years ago. Maybe they're not that interested in the details about the temple or the desolating sacrilege, which happened years and years ago, if Luke was written in the very late 1st century or even the early 2nd century. So that's something to think about. Then what will happen in Mark 13:21 through 23, there will be false Christs, false messiahs, and false prophets, and that has been edited out. And then in verse 25 of Luke 21, you get the coming of the Son of Man. And so 21:25 through 28, let me read that. There will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and upon the earth distress of nations, in perplexity at the roaring of the sea and the waves. Men fainting with fear and the foreboding of what is coming onto the world. for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Finally, verse 28. Now when these things begin to take place, look up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. So in other words, these cosmic things are happening, and finally the Son of Man comes to save those who are in the elect. And when will that be? Well, we are not told in the New Testament when that will be. Let's just be very clear about that. Anyone who tells you they know when the coming of the Son of Man will be, they wouldn't seem to be good readers of the New Testament, because the New Testament specifically says no one knows. Even Jesus doesn't know. Only God the Father knows. But looking at Luke 21, verses 29 to 33, and he told them a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they come out in leaf, you see for yourselves and know that the summer is already near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Verse 32, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all has taken place. And so it was believed that during the present generation of that, Paul believed the same thing when he wrote 1 Thessalonians, that it would be in his generation. He believed that when he wrote 1 Thessalonians, he believed that in his natural life he would see the second coming of Jesus. That turned out not to be the case. But, verse 33, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And then you have verses 34 through 36. Take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the cares of this life, and the day come upon you suddenly like a snare, for it will come upon all who dwell upon the face of the whole world. But watch at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that will take place, and to stand before the Son of Man. Of course, you stand as part of the Last Judgment. And then there's more about the ministry of Jesus in Jerusalem. Let me turn the right page here. Looking at chapter 21, verses 37 and following. This is very interesting. Luke 21:37. And every day he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and lodged on the mount called Olivet. He was doing this habitually, day by day, not just once. And early in the morning all people came to him in the temple to hear him. So he went to the temple and he taught within the temple precincts. And at night he stayed on the Mount of Olives. And he did this day by day. Literally in those days. So this seems to imply that it was for some period of time, not just a day or two. And then, as we move into chapter 21, we are now moving towards Jesus' death. 21:1 and 2. You have the scribes and the chief priests are meeting together, and they are seeking privately. I mean, this is not a public meeting, but they are meeting privately, and they are seeking how to put him to death, for they feared the people. And when was it? Verse 1. Now the feast of the unleavened bread drew near, which is called the Passover. Now, this has raised a lot of questions over time, namely the death of Jesus. I mean, why was Jesus killed? And one of the things that we as Christians, or anybody who is trying to deal fairly with Jews and Judaism, we have to emphasize is that this was not the whole Jewish population of Jerusalem. This was some of the Jewish leaders, the chief priests and the scribes. And so the whole of the Jewish people did not conspire to put Jesus to death. And by the way, it was the Romans who put Jesus to death. The Jews, some Jews wanted that to happen. Most Jews may well not have wanted that to happen. They wanted peace with the Romans. But somehow the Romans were convinced that it was to their advantage to have Jesus put to death, because they wanted to make an example of him so that there would not be any kind of uprising, as of course later there was in the year 66. Jesus' death was probably in the year 30 or in the year 33. Those are the two likely dates for his crucifixion. Well, the historical fact is that Jesus was put to death by the Romans. The Roman governor must have done so because he was advised that Jesus was dangerous to the firm grip on power that the Romans held in that Roman province. If they had been against the Jesus movement or against all Jews, then they would have done something against all Jews, or they would have tried to find out who was members of the Jesus movement. But as it is, they were not, and so basically they put Jesus to death. I think it's historically very unlikely that the Romans executed Jesus because Jesus had violated any kind of Jewish law. What would the Romans care? The writers and the editors of the Gospels, nonetheless, unfortunately, made every effort to blame, quote-unquote, the Jews, or some Jews, for the death of Jesus. And so there is, in that sense, there is a difference between what the New Testament texts say, and also, on the one hand, and on the other hand, what is historically really likely, and what is historically verifiable. Well, how did it happen? Well, Judas went to the chief priests and officers. Mark had the chief priests, and Luke added and officers. He sought an opportunity to betray him in the absence of the multitude. In other words, the betrayal of Jesus was not in the middle of the crowd in Jerusalem, in public. The betrayal of Jesus was in private, so that he could be arrested in private, so that the followers of Jesus would not riot against the Romans or riot against the Jewish leaders. Luke makes it clear to the readers that the chief priests wanted to have Jesus arrested when the usual crowds that followed Jesus were actually not around. Then, in 22:7 through 14, there is the preparation for the Passover. And the preparation for the Passover is very interesting because Jesus says, okay, go into the city and you see somebody carrying a big jar of water, follow him, and then there will be a large upper room, and then they will let you use that large upper room so that Jesus and his disciples can eat the Passover. By the way, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Last Supper is a Passover meal, whereas in John, in fact, it is not. But anyway, the preparation for the Passover, it's almost as if it's all arranged. In other words, Jesus knows that the man carrying the big jar of water will go into the place with the large upper room, and boom, that's where the Passover will be. Then you have the Last Supper. The Last Supper in 22:15 through 20. This is fundamentally a Markan passage. It's from Mark 14:22 and following, and also in Matthew 26. By the way, in the Gospel of John, you do not have the institution of the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper at this time. Actually, you don't have the institution of the Eucharist per se in John. But you have it here. Mark says, hey, this was a Passover meal. And Matthew and Luke follow Mark at that point. In John, it was not a Passover meal. But anyway, what happens, if you look in the synopsis, you'll see verses 15 through 18, you have Jesus taking a cup first and blessing the cup. and saying, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I shall not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he said, take this and divide it among yourselves. For I tell you that from now on I shall not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And that part right there, verses 15 through 18 of Luke 22, are peculiar to Luke. You do not have in Mark and Matthew cup, bread, cup. You just have bread, cup. And so the first cup of wine, which Jesus takes and passes around, that is unique to Luke. Anyway, starting in verse 19 of Luke 22, he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And likewise the cup after supper, saying, this cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood, etc. No one knows why you have cup, bread, cup. In other words, the first cup in Luke. No one knows why that is there. But we do know, of course, in the Passover Seder, which of course is of medieval origin, we are told, that you have like 4 cups of wine. So that's a very good question. But nonetheless, the Last Supper probably just had, it was a Passover meal according to Mark, and then it had the bread and Jesus saying, this is my body, and then at the end of supper you have the cup. This cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. That's a little different from Mark. Mark has, this is my blood of the covenant which is poured out for many. And Matthew is closer to Mark. So the Last Supper narrative is that we say in church at the beginning or in the Eucharistic prayer comes from here, and it also comes from 1 Corinthians 11. The Eucharist in the Synoptic tradition, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Eucharist was at the Last Supper, and it is a Passover meal. And this Passover meal has been given a very new and different meaning by Jesus. In the Gospel of John, you do not have the institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper. It is not a Passover meal, but a chaborah, a fellowship meal. And the greatest Anglican book on liturgy of all time, John Gregory Dix's book, The Shape of the Liturgy, argued that Jesus instituted the Eucharist at a chaborah meal rather than at a Passover meal. By the way, in the current Book of Common Prayer of 1979, you obviously do the Eucharist on Maundy Thursday if you have a priest, and you can do the washing of feet at the Maundy Thursday liturgy. I am far from certain that it's a really good idea to do it. I have done it, but I don't do it anymore because my knees can't take it. So I'm not really sure in the Eucharist of Maundy Thursday, I'm not really sure what the washing of feet is really about. And so I don't do it. I think that you have to kind of, you have to decide whether you want to do Maundy Thursday like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or you want to do the Last Supper like in John. And I am not sure why it's a good idea to try to put the two together. And I'm sure that there are many people who disagree with me on that one. Finally, Jesus portrays his betrayal, and Jesus knows who his betrayer is going to be. It's going to be Judas Iscariot. This passage does not portray the disciples of Jesus in a favorable light. And then in a passage that has been put here in Luke 22, verses 24 to 30, it's in a very different location in Mark 10 and in Matthew 20. This is a Markan passage, but it's been put here in Luke because Luke wants to emphasize for his readers that the disciples, if they are really living up to what Jesus had in mind, they don't really worry about precedence. In other words, who is the greatest among them. Let me just read that for you. Luke 22, 24 to 30. A dispute also arose among them, which of them was to be regarded as the greatest? And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. For which is the greater, one who sits at table or the one who serves? Is it not one who sits at table? But I am among you as one who serves. And so that is a perpetual reminder to the church that even though the disciples were very interested in who was the greatest within the Christian community, within the community of Jesus believers, Jesus was against the idea that one was greater than another. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody in the Christian community all has the same job. Far from that. But nonetheless, you can see that, mine is better than yours, or I'm more important than you. You can see that arose very early, even during the earthly life of Jesus. So if it arises in your parish somewhere, please know that it's always been there in the church. Everybody wants to make themselves greater than what they really are. And Jesus seems to be totally against this. So keep that in mind as you do your thing. Then the next one, of course, is that Peter is going to deny Jesus not once, but 3 times. That's very interesting. Jesus in Mark 8 and Mark 9 and Mark 10, and the parallels are in Matthew and Luke, also 3 times. Jesus tells his disciples that he is going to be arrested and put to death, and that he's going to rise from the dead. And of course, the first time in Mark 8 and in Matthew 16, Peter doesn't agree with it, and Peter actually rebukes Jesus. Imagine that. And so Peter here, if he is the head of the Apostolic College, he is in Mark shown not in a really very good light. And that's very interesting because the Papias fragments from the 2nd century tell us that Papias wrote the Gospel according, or Mark wrote the Gospel according to Mark, from what Peter remembered. Now, if Mark is really from the reminiscences of Peter, like Eusebius says in Book 3, and like we find elsewhere, and that information about Mark and Peter comes from the Papias fragments, wouldn't you kind of expect that Peter would get, shall we say, a better press than Peter gets in the Gospel according to Mark? But that seems indeed not to be the case. So, Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Jesus prophesies Peter's betrayal. He says, Peter actually says, I'm going to do anything for you, Jesus. And then Jesus says, you're going to deny me actually 3 times. And after it's going to happen, you're going to do it 3 times, and then the rooster will crow. Now, so I don't think that anyone could really say that the Gospel of Mark portrays Peter in a very positive light. I certainly don't think so. So nonetheless, the denial of Jesus is 3 times. And it looks like, of course, Peter denies knowing Jesus, even though he has a Galilean accent. And even though a slave girl has seen him with the other disciples, Peter says, it's not me. Hell no, it's not me. And then when he does this the 3rd time, the rooster crows. And then finally, you have this final thing about the 2 swords, which is unique to Luke. Let me read it for you. Luke 22:35-38. And he said to them, and this is Jesus, when he said to them, when I sent you out with no purse or bag or sandals, did you lack anything? They said, nothing. He said to them, but now let him who has a purse take it, and likewise a bag. And let him who has no sword sell his mantle and buy one. For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me. Quote, and he was reckoned with transgressors. In other words, the one who was going to be put to death was reckoned with people who violated the law. And so someone said, "Look, Lord, here are 2 swords." And he said to them, "It is enough." So it sounds as if Jesus is saying, hey, I'm about to be arrested. And that's where our next session will take up, where Jesus is actually arrested. And so what does this thing about the 2 swords mean? I really do not know. But it really gets you into the issue of just what was Jesus' power during his earthly life, and just how did Jesus relate to earthly power during his earthly life. And here in these very difficult verses, it shows Jesus saying, make sure instead of just having 1 sword, make sure you have 2 swords. So nonetheless, the disciples, Jesus is certainly portrayed as knowing that he's about to be arrested and that he's going to be put on trial, if you can call it a trial, and he's going to be condemned and crucified and die. And Jesus is certainly, he certainly seems to be making the disciples aware that he is not going to be around in his earthly life anymore. So we will end our session here. This is the end of session 9, and then you will also see session 10. And session 10 will be our last session on Luke. And then later, also on YouTube, we hope to put on a 6-session class on 1 Thessalonians, the first letter to the Thessalonians, and the subtitle is The Early Paul. And we will begin that on September 19th of 2021, and that will proceed for 6 weeks. So here is where we end this part of Luke, and we have one more session, which is session 10, and then we'll have a little break for about 3 weeks, and it's hard to believe today, as I'm re-recording this is the last day of August, and so fall is really coming. Thank you for tuning in and for being a part of this class. And if you have comments about this class, it would be good if you would let us know. And you could send those comments to us at the Church of